It was definitely not worth listening to this old scoundrel whose cunning yellow eyes pierced the hero from behind his glasses. He assured that there was no need to think about anything, just sign the documents. The boy had already raised his hand with the pen over the sheets, silently opening and closing his mouth in indecision. The hum of the cafe interrupted the stifling silence at the table. The hero finally asked again if it was really safe. The man, in a fit of anger, slammed his hand on the table and exclaimed irritably that he had just told him not to think about anything and to sign. Then he smiled, his glasses glinting in the lamplight, extended his hand to the boy, declaring that he would not deceive his school friend, to whom he had told everything, from the deposit guarantee to compound interest. The interlocutor simply needs to invest money where told, and they will see each other. Not everyone is offered this, and they just want to help. The man said it was heartbreaking to see the guy answering work calls right during his father's funeral and bowing to the boss. When the bastard mentioned his father, Lucas felt angry for a moment, but he couldn't do anything about it. All that remained was to hope that this help was sincere. That was all the guy could do. As it turned out, he acted like a complete idiot, completely unaware of the deceiver's devilish grin. 2 years later, Lucas hit rock bottom and his life became a living nightmare. After drinking a huge amount of cheap booze, the guy felt sick for several hours straight. Moreover, he bought food for the first time in a long time, and it all ended with him throwing up even more. An ordinary 28-year-old man in America, his life is far from this definition. It's been impossible to reach the bastard who dragged the hero into this for a year now, and the guy himself has been barely finding money for basic needs and endless debts. There were 5 hours left before his part-time job, so he had a little time to read before bed, which was the only outlet in Lucas's decaying life. My hand automatically reached for a novel in a black cover called Dark Heather. The hero promised that he would read it for only 30 minutes. The book had been reread more than 100 times, but it always enchanted him in a new way. Luca knew the story by heart. It's a saving escape from his lousy life, even if only for a moment. Suddenly, the hero noticed something strange out of the corner of his eye in the window and looked away in shock. Standing out brightly against the night sky, several black feathers flew towards him, seemingly burning with a purple fire. Thought absently, with his mind clouded by lack of sleep, that the feathers might belong to a raven, Lucas did not yet feel the thin stream of blood flowing from his nose. But the next moment, the guy started coughing, and a new portion of blood poured out of his mouth. Something was choking him, not allowing him to breathe, and he began to cough, staining the book lying on his knees with blood. Lucas cried out as his heart was struck with unbearable pain, something he had never experienced before. The fear of death became terrifyingly obvious. It was impossible to breathe. The guy no longer saw how the mysterious and gloomy aura was hovering around the novel. Trying to stop the blood flowing from his nose and mouth, the hero muttered that life wasn't fair at all. Sitting on the bed, stained with his own blood, Lucas thought languidly that he would have to die like this, senselessly. And just when he thought it was for the best, something inside him began to boil. Just think, the last thing that comes to mind at that very moment is that bastard's face. It was a real curse, and Lucas could do absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, the feathers at his window kept increasing. A strange dream woke the young gentleman up, and he almost fell out of bed, waking up abruptly. Lucas quickly threw off the blanket, not understanding what had just happened. But what was even stranger was that the surroundings were completely unfamiliar. Somehow, the boy woke up in a strange house. Moreover, the decor resembled the residence of some noble person. There was a vague sound from the side. Lucas trembled, but still slowly turned around. Near the closed window, on a tree branch, sat a raven with red eyes, looking at the man with interest. Blinking a few times, Lucas saw that there were many more birds. For some reason, the guy's gaze angered one of the birds, and it burst into the room with a loud cawing, flying straight at the young gentleman. He pressed himself against the wall of the bed, screaming for help and covering himself with his hands, not understanding what kind of nightmare this was and why this was happening. The raven's body and sharp beak were getting closer. Lucas closed his eyes tightly, begging to wake up from this dream quickly. But suddenly, instead of pecking at him, the raven turned gloomy and began to rub its head against the human hand. Lucas looked at the bird in surprise, not understanding what had happened to it, why the raven had become so friendly. The raven suddenly jumped off Lucas's knee and flew back out the window onto the street. At the same time, his brothers suddenly flew off their branches and flew away. The guy got out of bed and walked over to the wide window. His attention was drawn to something completely unusual. There was an unusual moon shining in the sky, but 3 of them, and they were of different colors and sizes. The city that was visible from the windows was completely different from how Lucas remembered it. Rather, the small, identical houses resembled some kind of medieval village. At first, the guy was confused, but seeing his new face in the reflection of the window, he quickly understood everything. This was not the reality he knew. This place was most likely a novel, and he himself had now become Prince Rudy Abiran. There was a loud knock on the door. A certain Anna asked permission to enter. The guy exclaimed that he couldn't open it. He wasn't feeling well. The girl stopped knocking but flinched when she heard a loud knock. Rudy, in a hurry to lock the door, fell to the floor, hitting his head hard. The maid muttered from behind the door that she would come later, and the hero realized that his suspicions were confirmed. This place was definitely a novel he had read countless times. The world of the Dark Header, and the one Lucas possessed, was the 7th prince of this empire, Rudy Abiran. This man is destined to die a miserable death at the very beginning of history, a real curse. The guy sat up in bed and wondered how it had happened. He woke up inside a novel, but in the form of this very person. A wheedling male voice was heard behind me as he silently entered the room. Hearing the name Marshal, Rudy's heart went cold, because this was the 7th prince's assistant. Anna stood next to the man. He said that he heard about His Highness's decision to skip dinner, and therefore he was worried and came in person. The man adjusted his glasses, adding that he had prepared a modest meal, asking Rudy if he was feeling any better. The guy swallowed hard, realizing that he needed to stay calm, and for starters, pretend to be a real prince. He got out of bed, headed towards the servants, and, stuttering a little, said that he felt better. The marshal noticed that this was a relief and ordered the maid to set the table for His Majesty. The girl replied in a weak voice that she would obey. Rudy thanked her. Watching Anna, he was surprised that she was shaking, and the prepared food looked more like dog food. She placed the kettle on the table so slowly that the guy reached for it, saying that he would pour himself some tea. Anna screamed in surprise and dropped the teapot from her hands. The kettle fell, and hot water spilled onto the floor, almost hitting the prince's foot. The girl was so scared that she froze for a few seconds, as if she was preparing for the death penalty. She hiccuped loudly and fell to her knees with inhuman speed, begging His Highness for forgiveness. Rudy didn't understand why Anna was acting as if a disaster had happened, while she wiped up the water, constantly asking for forgiveness. Suddenly, Lucas remembered the reason. In the novel, Rudy was a complete scumbag. Not only did he smash everything and use his hands when he got irritated, but he could also kill a servant if she got into a bad mood. The girl muttered that she had committed a mortal sin and begged for mercy. Meanwhile, the marshal spoke up, saying that he was very surprised because the noble prince was not feeling well. He added that he was glad that the gentleman was now okay and asked for forgiveness for interrupting the meal. The assistant pushed the plate aside sharply and unrolled a scroll in front of Rudy, asking him to sign the budget plan first. When the pen was literally shoved into the boy's hands, he frowned, thinking about what kind of important matters the talentless and stupid 7th prince could possibly have. It's obvious that this is just a fake, all because the Empress's relative is trying to appropriate a share of the prince's budget. The reason why a mere servant like the marshal can go so far is because he is related to the Empress, except that the powerful Empress has incredible influence over this world. But the previous owner of this body was a fool and didn't know any of this, so should Rudy sign this so that the plot doesn't change? The man made a sympathetic face, as if mocking the gentleman. He drawled, "Has he really forgotten how to sign documents? It's quite shameful, no matter what kind of prince he was. To be openly ridiculed by an assistant, despite his status as a member of the royal family, even if Rudy was caught in an affair. Why in the role of the 7th prince? The marshal feigned a yawn, saying that this was precisely why an assistant was needed, so the gentleman didn't need to think and simply needed to sign the documents. At that moment, Lucas clearly remembered his state when he signed the papers from his friend's father. The man's face was so similar to the one he saw before him now. This is no different from reality, where the hero was simply used. He will not live like that anymore. He took a deep breath and let it out, telling Marshall that some things looked strange if he counted them. The man narrowed his eyes when he heard that the documents indicated obvious embezzlement of funds. Then he grinned, slightly nervously, replying that it was surprising if the prince had such thoughts. He had underestimated His Highness. Shifting from foot to foot, he pointed out to Rudy that his food was getting cold. If he signed first, the man would double-check everything. After repeating that there was no need to worry and that he needed to sign, Marshall gasped when he saw a teapot flying at him. Anna, sitting on the floor, experienced her second shock of the evening without raising her head. In front of her were numerous fragments of a broken teapot and the glasses of the seventh prince's assistant. Having barely dodged, Marshall screamed, asking Rudy what he was doing. The guy shrugged, saying that his hand slipped. Since he has read this novel more than 100 times, he cannot help but know this. The Marshal is a relative of the Empress, but in fact their relationship is so distant that the Empress does not even suspect of his existence. The man muttered timidly, asking what the seventh prince was doing. But his eyes widened in disbelief when the next moment His Highness knocked the table down with one movement of his hand. Lucas doesn't know how he got here, but he's not going to die meekly, like in the original story, saying his hand slipped because Marshall was too distracting, because he has to take responsibility. In that reality, he was born with nothing. The guy was ignored everywhere, and Rudy lived, constantly remaining at a loss, and now he will not allow this to happen again, under any circumstances. Needing to use all the knowledge from the novel and the power of the seventh prince, looking at Marshall, Rudy asked why he was just standing there. The seventh prince raised his hand and pointed his finger at the floor, indicating that the carpet was dirty. Gathering all his anger and remembering the prince's character from the book, Rudy ordered the man to leave. A large puddle formed under his feet, drowning the fragments, but even then Lucas decided that he would survive, no matter what. The Imperial family are gods. Everything in this world exists for their sake. With special abilities that only members of the royal family can possess, and beautiful golden hair, they are the literal embodiment of the gods and the very symbol of nobility. Of course, with the exception of this worthless seventh prince who ruins the whole aesthetic. He is stupid, has a bad temper, and has disgusting black hair. Could this really be a member of the Imperial family? A pathetic bastard who does nothing but tiptoe around other princes. Did the marshal really give out bribes just to work for a guy like that? Inside himself, the assistant had already boiled with anger 1,000 times and was ready to burst into curses. But in reality he could not disobey the prince, and he obeyed, carefully wiping the floor. Gritting his teeth, the man almost growled when a mug of tea fell to the floor right in front of his nose. The marshal hysterically asked what that meant, but Rudy calmly replied that it was possible to practice, since the man had spent so much time on a simple task. Looking at his assistant with his devilish gaze, the guy firmly ordered him to get out of there quickly. The marshal bared his teeth, hissing that the prince was behaving rather strangely, and that he would still think about what to say to the empress. Rudy knew that this man would not dare even utter a peep in front of the empress, but they still threatened him. Apparently, what they had done was not enough for him to come to his senses. Deciding it was best to clear the situation up right away, Rudy ordered Anna to cover her ears. He said with a threatening voice that people like her should not hear such things. If she overheard even a word, she would be forced to work without fingers. The girl squeaked in fear that she was listening and covered her ears with her hands as tightly as she could. Meanwhile, the seventh prince looked straight into the assistant's eyes, saying something to him. From the very beginning, the man was openly angry, preparing to counter with something. But all the subsequent speeches of His Highness frightened the marshal so much that he could barely stand on his feet from horror. The man's face instantly turned pale. It seemed as if he saw a dead man. Later, Anna told the other maids about this, not forgetting to add that the seventh prince had become a little strange lately. The girls agreed, because the guy had become much scarier. They didn't even know if they would live to see next year. And yet what a relief that the maids didn't encounter the guy, because he doesn't go anywhere and sits in his palace. By the way, Anna was reminded that she had to be on duty, and when it was her turn to clean, the girl completely forgot about it. Rudy stood by the window with a cup of tea, thinking that since he behaved like the seventh prince from the novel, he shouldn't arouse much suspicion, and his servants seemed to avoid him out of fear. From that very day on, Marshall's insolence evaporated, and he didn't approach the guy at all. The reason Rudy can afford to be so relaxed is that he still has time, 1 year before the start of the original story and 3 years before he dies. A novel Lucas has read over 100 times, he still clearly remembers the day he came across this tattered book in the corner of the local library. The appearance of the main character is still a long way off, but for now, we can simply elegantly enjoy our free time. Anyway, the weather was really great. Rudy thought if he had wings, it would be great to see this scenery. Immediately after this thought, the guy's eyes suddenly darkened, then the whole world turned pink. He felt so bad and sick that the cup fell out of his hands and shattered into pieces. The guy fell to the floor. Everything happened so suddenly, his body literally burned like fire. It felt somehow different than last time, but still, my body felt like it was on real fire. Anna's voice was heard, asking if she could come into the office to clean up, but the boy's cries for help seemed to get stuck in his throat. The girl knocked again, and when she heard no answer, she sighed with relief. That meant the gentleman was not in this room. She walked freely into the room, asking for forgiveness loudly, just in case, but suddenly saw an open window and a broken cup. Anna squatted down, muttering that it was a waste, because if she sold that one mug, her family could eat for a whole month. Suddenly, a strange sound attracted the maid's attention, and she turned around. And then she almost fell over in surprise. She saw a crow, which for some reason was in the room, looking at the girl. Anna stood up abruptly, clutching the broom tightly in her hands, not knowing what to do in this situation. She grabbed the bird in her arms like a kitten, lamenting how the little crow got here because a very scary person lives here. In fact, the seventh prince himself was now in her hands. Rudy couldn't believe it. How could he turn from a young master into a crow? How could that even happen? The girl went to the window. She intended to release the bird into the wild, because if the prince caught them in the room, then no one would be in trouble. Anna exclaimed that the raven should fly far, far away, but the bird did not think so, because Rudy in her body looked with horror at the distant land and kept trying with a loud croak to order them not to let the prince go. But of course, it didn't work, and a few seconds later, Rudy was falling like a stone. The green foliage was rapidly approaching. It seemed that he would soon die, fall, and crash to his death. What can one do to survive? Should one just use wings? Finally, in a desperate feeling of incredible panic, Rudy managed to persuade himself to fly so as not to die here. When the tree branches had already touched the wings, the bird flapped its wings and actually soared into the air. The guy really did fly, driven by some kind of bird-like instinct. It couldn't be explained otherwise. He flies. He really flies. It's just an incredible feeling that cannot be experienced in the human body. A few hours later, Rudy was already in his office. Fortunately, he managed to acquire a human form. The guy even tried to do this several times to make sure. He actually gained the ability to turn into a crow at will. You can transform just by wanting to. But why a crow? Could it really be some kind of curse from the bird that latched onto the guy on the very first day? After all, such an ability has never been mentioned in history. Rudy didn't know why he had gained this power, but it was obvious that he couldn't let anyone know about it under any circumstances. The transformation into a crow is an ability that was never mentioned in the novel, which could potentially ruin the plot development. This ability is undoubtedly connected with Manus. As soon as the hero thought about it, Anna's meek voice was heard, reminding him that the evening ritual would soon begin. Rudy turned over his shoulder, frozen for a moment. Finally, this day had come. Once a month, the emperor and his children gather for a sacred ritual. They call it a ritual, but in reality, it is a test for the heirs. Of course, the seventh prince wasn't even considered as a candidate. But seeing it in person after just reading it was a completely different feeling, Rudy thought as he sat down at the common table at the very end. Perhaps it is the golden hair of the heirs, but it is almost painful to look at it. It shines so much. Compared to it, the seventh prince is no different from a crow. Suddenly, someone's nasty voice screeched that the feeble-minded bastard was holding his head so shamelessly. It was the 17th Prince Richard, Rudy's half-brother, who obviously didn't consider the boy his brother, and those harsh words were definitely directed at the hero. Rudy knew that he and Richard were just minor villains who appeared briefly in the plot. The boy, meanwhile, was shouting that this bastard had gone deaf until the first princess calmed her brother down, patting him on the shoulder and saying that they should get along and not make a scene in front of His Majesty the Emperor. Closer to the Emperor sat the first, second, third princes and the princess, literally seated in order of rank. The brighter their hair, the more power they possess, and they also possess a special power unique to this world. They are considered true members of the Imperial family. Compared to them, the previous owner of the body had blue-black hair, the only prince born without Manus. No wonder his character was so bad. The pinnacle of menace in the history of this world was His Majesty the Emperor. He just entered the room. All the children stood up abruptly and bowed. The man had glory in one hand, conviction in the other, and death at the tips of his closed fingers. The pinnacle of this empire is the emperor. He ran his hand over his beard, saying that there was no time to waste, and that we must begin immediately. This blue stone slab in front of him is an ancient artifact left by the first Emperor Dul, and it was into this that Manus was poured. The plate measured a person's strength level. It was necessary to place the palms of the hands on it. The indicator for measuring the amount of manis is intuitive. The light spreads from the stove, then to the very edge of the table, as expected from His Majesty. But what was strange was whether the light had actually reached the edge of the table in the first place. The man commanded those willing to take up the challenge to step forward in a commanding voice. The seventh prince was silent, looking gloomily at his brothers. He did nothing. The first prince, who was sitting close to the emperor, raised his hand, saying that he would try. There were no strict restrictions, but traditionally only the first prince participates in the ritual because the manis's indicators, once measured, rarely change. The number of manis is equivalent to the amount of one's power, and the first prince periodically demonstrates his power in front of the entire imperial family, showing who is currently at the top of the power hierarchy and who is actually the next emperor. But now, something went wrong. The prince froze and coughed loudly, opening his eyes wide. The second prince suddenly jumped up from his seat and screamed in fear, trying to understand what was wrong with his brother. Meanwhile, the first prince's nose began to bleed thickly and the boy pressed his palm to his face. There were shouts. Someone was calling for a doctor. Rudy also got up from the table. In that moment of chaos, he was the only one who understood exactly what was happening. The first prince will soon die, bleeding from every pore of his body. And so the main plot began. Manus is a special power in this world. It usually manifests itself in members of the imperial family and their descendants, but the abilities themselves vary from person to person. For example, the first prince uses the manus of water, and the second prince uses the manus of fire. The result of today's measurement of the first prince's manus has already been predetermined. Most likely, his strength will only be enough to cover a little more than half of the table. This makes sense considering that there were still 6 months left before the incident, but now this man was in pain. According to the original plot, the first prince was not supposed to bleed for another 6 months, and the main character's appearance occurs after that. It's strange that the seventh prince can transform into a crow. He was originally a character who couldn't use manus at all, an ability that never appeared in the novel, manifested immediately after Lucas entered this body. Late in the evening, a doctor arrived at the castle of the first Prince Edward, and after examining the man, he said that he found nothing strange. The prince's body is itself a blessing from the gods. It is not affected by any injuries or illnesses. Edward got tired of listening to the doctor's confused explanations, and he grabbed him by the throat, lifting him above himself without even getting up from his seat, croaking that he didn't want to listen to useless nonsense. Squeezing the doctor's throat even tighter, he called him a pathetic cockroach and ordered him to get lost. When the man was left alone, he ran to the mirror and, in despair, punched his own reflection. Everything was fine this morning, and yesterday was no different from any other day. The man tried to use Manus, but pain again pierced his exhausted body. The prince howled in indignation, abruptly dropping to his haunches and pressing his bloody fist to his face. Every time he tries to use Manus, his whole body feels like it's on fire. Will he never be able to use his power again? It's impossible, because he was the first prince of the empire, the next ruler of this empire. He was not like all those pathetic insects. The man took a drag from the hookah standing on the table, deciding that nothing serious had happened and that he should rest a little. Suddenly, someone from behind a dark corner said that if the prince wanted to live, he had to give up the hookah. The man threw the cup in that direction in surprise, and Rudy, who was standing there, looked away, thinking that when it came to brute force, the first prince was simply a monster. The man laughed when he saw him, because he thought that someone had sent an assassin, but it was just a cripple who didn't even know how to use Manus. Rudy interrupted him, rightly noting that if he were the murderer, Edward would no longer be a tenant. After all, he didn't even notice his brother until he spoke. Someone like him was able to sneak into the future emperor's chambers, the second most guarded place in the empire, without a trace. The prince was scared, but didn't show it. When he asked how his brother got into his room, he only shrugged, answering that he climbed up the wall from the outside. At first, Edward didn't believe it, but Rudy said that this wasn't the main thing now, and it didn't matter whether they believed him or not. Rudy pressed his question on how the first prince was feeling, as the court physician had said that everything was fine, but Edward should know the state of his body better than anyone else. The man's lips suddenly stretched into a grin as if he had suddenly gone crazy. He suddenly burst into mad laughter, throwing his head back. After clearing his throat, he shook his head, saying that the seventh prince was smarter than he seemed. Edward admitted that his brother had slipped him poison and planned to use it as leverage, simply to preserve his life after the first prince became emperor. Shouting that if that was the plan, Rudy had miscalculated, the man rushed at him. But in response, the seventh prince calmly said that in a week Edward himself would be begging for death when blood would flow from his eyes and ears. The first prince froze, stopping halfway, asking with his lips what this meant. Then Rudy sauntered over to the sofa and sat down on it, crossing his legs, then decided to make everything clear. He wasn't using any tricks or weaving any intrigues. But the first prince's condition will rapidly deteriorate, and eventually he will die, bleeding from every pore, but it is still unclear who is behind this. But Edward needs to know one thing for sure. He must now listen carefully to one piece of information. He grimaced when he heard that this was his last chance to save his life. Having turned into a raven and flying away from the castle, Rudy became convinced that Edward was just as short-sighted and cowardly as he was in the novel, and did not even send anyone to follow his brother. For a time, it will be possible to use it as the seventh prince pleases. The ability to transform into a crow is very convenient. It allows one to visit many more places than the seventh prince thought. Rudy the raven slowed down for a moment. Perhaps he should do something else now that he was out. Having completed the maneuver, the bird turned sharply and flew back. Early in the morning, Anna was already knocking on the door of the young master's chambers, or rather, she was only thinking of doing so. She stood at the door, thinking that the prince had not eaten anything for 2 days, and not a single sound came from his room. But what if something terrible happened to the prince? Anna already imagined that the criminal would receive the maximum punishment for the murder of a member of the royal family. The girl became extremely nervous and began to knock on the door with all her might, calling on His Highness to answer. Anna screamed that she was coming in, when at that moment the door opened and Rudy appeared on the threshold, not understanding what the noise was about. The door opened so abruptly that Anna dropped her tray on the floor and fell after it. She, trembling with indescribable horror, slowly raised her eyes, seeing that the owner's boots were stained with tea. Rudy stood silently over her, looking rather shabby and piercing the maid with an uncomprehending gaze. The girl fell to her knees and screamed desperately that she had committed a crime worthy of death. She thought that His Highness might become ill. Anna was sobbing, tears clouding her eyes and stuttering as Rudy began to scold the maid. Not only did she cause this commotion, but she also got the floor and shoes dirty, and the girl screamed that she deserved to die and that the master should spare her family. Suddenly, he fell silent and ordered the servants to clean everything to a shine in 5 minutes and get lost. The guy turned around and returned to the room, saying that until he called her himself, Anna was strictly forbidden to approach her chambers. A month has passed since the first prince bled during the ritual. A certain rumor quietly spread through the Imperial palace. The first prince, the future emperor, had lost his powers. For other princes and princesses, this rumor signaled that a golden opportunity had arrived. In the novel, in order to quell the rumors, the first prince begs the emperor to hold the hunting competition early, except for the small matter that it was to take place only 6 months later. Luckily, so far the events have more or less followed the original plot. The problem is whether this only happens within the Imperial city or whether it has affected the main character outside of it as well. On the day of the royal hunting competition, if he's lucky, Rudy will meet his brother at today's event and will be able to pass on that thing. After that, the 7th prince would wait for the right moment, but at that moment, the 17th Prince Richard rudely called out to Rudy. Sitting on a white stallion, he teased the boy, saying that a black horse suited his dark nature. But the 7th did not even pay attention, worrying that the first prince was more hot-tempered than in the novel, due to the fact that the events take place before the beginning of the original story. Therefore, the hero decided to ignore Richard because today he had an important matter to attend to. The black horse was chosen to make fun of Rudy, but the prince liked him more than the golden one. At least, the 7th prince knew how to win over animals. After some time, the servants announced that the gentleman had arrived at the place. Finally, the protagonist saw with his own eyes the famous entrance to the Imperial forest. Here it is, the Tower of the Beginning where the ritual is held every year. Rudy knew that once the prince completed the ritual, the hunting competition would begin immediately. In fact, it is not so much a competition as a tough political show. The emperor informed the first prince that he should prepare for the upcoming opening ritual. The second brother greeted the first warmly and asked if he had made a wish. The winner of the hunting competition may ask his imperial majesty because the first prince will still be the winner today. The ritual is a way to demonstrate the manes of the future emperor, a demonstration of the power of the imperial family in front of the nobility. The common people onlookers were talking among themselves, saying that it was a great honor for them to finally see Manus with their own eyes. But someone had heard about the original incident, but they were immediately silenced. The first prince was incredibly angry because he really listened to the words of the damned idiot. It would be better if he didn't bluff. The face of that stupid boy still flashed before my eyes. The first prince began to perform the ritual, angry at Rudy because if he deceived him, he would kill him with his own hands. Moreover, he will do it in the most painful way possible. Rudy only laughed at the first prince's appearance, who was all tense. If he followed all the instructions exactly as he should, something interesting will happen. Standing on the stairs, Edward was extremely focused. A sphere vibrated in his hands, from which lightning emanated in all directions. A bright blue light filled the entire space, reflecting in the eyes of the delighted people. The whirlwind, which should not have passed the place where Edward stood, suddenly went out of control. People became frightened when one of the observers was suddenly pulled into the circle. Rudy frowned, continuing to watch what was happening from the sidelines. The first prince clenched his teeth, blood trickling from his mouth as he struggled to maintain control. Raising his hands, he shouted that he would become emperor, and the blue sphere flew upward. A flame of incredible scorching power rushed upward, turning into the head of a terrifying dragon. The spectators, of whom there were an incredible number, watched this with bated breath. Finally, after some time, the sky cleared, and along with the sun, rain began to fall to the ground. The palace soldier shook his head. Now he understood the strength of the imperial family's manes. Edward wiped the blood away with the back of his hand as he listened to the people praise the first prince. Even earlier, the 7th prince gave his brother a stone, where he told him to release his manes. Edward thought he was being mocked, but he was told that the object would absorb the contaminated manus, but if he did not want to be treated, he could die. Rudy had no desire to save the first prince against his will. Now the guy, as he mounted his horse, thought that this had bought him a little time. This item was only supposed to appear in the second half of the original story. But there shouldn't be any problems due to early use, and now a breathless assistant was running after the guy. He was barely breathing, carrying the bag that Rudy had left for him on his back, and he only chuckled when he noticed that Marshall had arrived. He turned and over his shoulder called the assistant the man who had failed a simple task and asked if he had brought the bag back safe and sound. The man was sweating profusely and said nothing, even though he had ridden here on a wild horse. At that moment, the sound of the royal horn resounded throughout the entire area. This meant that the emperor himself was ready to give his speech. His Majesty announced that from this very moment the royal hunting competitions were declared open. The warriors ran forward, talking to each other, each wanting to win so that the emperor would fulfill his wish. Rudy just grinned at the rush everyone was in, but the competition wasn't that important to him. It was necessary to find the former commander-in-chief of the Imperial Knights, Anthony, who was now standing next to the servant Evan, asking what he thought about the ritual of opening the hunting competition. A large guy with round glasses corrected them comically, saying that it was truly divine power. The man said that when he watched this ritual, it seemed to him that the emperor wanted to break the spirit of the aristocracy. The boy began to look around in fear, whispering that the Duke should say such things in private, to which Anthony said that there was no one around who could overhear the conversation. There is a reason why Edward is still alive at his age, at least for now. The Imperial Forest, where hunting competitions take place, is divided into 3 main zones. The first is the small animal zone at the entrance, followed by the medium animal zone, and the large animal zone is located in the very depths of the forest. The novel said that the Duke presented the Emperor with a golden fox at the competition. The only problem was that it was only mentioned briefly in a flashback scene, so Rudy didn't know where to find it. This is why the hero so often explored the vast imperial forest in the form of a raven, because golden foxes are difficult to find, so it was necessary to narrow the search. Considering that, in the book, the character washed his hands in water immediately after the hunt, Rudy decided that the place should be near the shore of the lake in the southwest direction. Sometimes it seemed to the boy that the horse understood him at a glance, especially now, when he suggested getting ahead of the Duke and waiting for a certain moment, and the animal neighed joyfully. Rudy clutched the strap of the bag in his hand, glad that Marshall had managed to bring it. Even though he had been late, now the thing could easily be handed to Anthony. But the joy quickly vanished when the previously calm horse suddenly braked sharply, digging its hooves into the ground. She stopped so suddenly that the guy thought the animal was sick. Then he began to ask her kindly whether she had met an animal nearby, but the horse, as if understanding his words, shook its head sharply. Rudy's eyes widened, a strange thought entering his head. When he asked if the bag was too heavy, the mare nodded affirmatively, which amazed her rider. Finally, he got angry and started shouting at the animal, which was being stubborn as much as it could, while other horses were pulling carts, and he was being tormented because of some bag and one person. Rudy began to threaten that if the horse continued to behave so impudently, he would order the groom to starve it. The result of this monologue was this: when the prince got off the mare, she immediately ran away far into the forest. Rudy was left alone, looking at the animal in confusion, holding his bag in his hands. The guy swallowed hard, knowing in his gut that this was the end for him now. The mission could fail. Meanwhile, the Duke and his servant wandered through the forest in the hope of catching a couple of wolves or deer. Usually by this time it would be a piece of cake, but it looks like luck is just not on their side today. Anthony shook his head, admitting that he had aged, having lived his whole life as a sword and shield, but, alas, he was not destined to resist time. Evan immediately urged the gentleman not to speak like that, because the Duke was considered a real legend. After all, it was he who had accomplished countless feats as commander of the Imperial Knights, to which Evan retorted that he was now just a retired old man. The man changed the subject as he made his way through the thick branches and asked Evan if he had ever seen the Imperial family up close, and the boy admitted that he had only seen them from afar. The Duke said that he would understand when he came face to face with them and would see who the majestic beings of this empire truly were. They are gods in their own right, and the Emperor's family has been protecting the empire of such gods for 1,000 years. Once upon a time, he was riding in a carriage with his son and was telling him that the boy was obliged to take his place because their family should be proud of being devoted to the imperial house. The man showed the family's trading guild, as they always proudly supply goods to the imperial family. He had hardly begun to tell his son about the city's temple when suddenly the carriage shook violently and stopped. The Duke jumped out in irritation and began shouting at the driver, who apologized, saying that something was stuck in the wheel. The boy was frightened and asked Anthony to return to the carriage to sort things out himself. The man had already placed his foot on the step when he suddenly turned his head and saw a terrifying sight. As it turned out, a homeless child had fallen under the wheels of a carriage. The small body was sprawled on the road, and blood was dripping from the wheels. The Duke remembered that he had already heard about a vagabond who had been caught stealing jewelry from the temple offerings. The man couldn't take his eyes off the boy's dead eyes, knowing that such deaths were common in these parts. Anthony's son, who had been left in the carriage, also wanted to get out and see. But the father stopped the child with a shout, blocking his way with his hand, and he froze in fear. The Duke was in such shock that he could not stop stuttering to explain to his son what had happened. The man whispered under his breath that it was just a trifle, unable to turn away from the dead child. Now, for some reason, this image appeared before his eyes again. Anthony looked at the sky, remembering that boy who was not even 10 years old. So he was younger than his son. That child was probably burned in an incinerator. Is there really darkness even in such a noble empire? Evan shouted at the Duke that they didn't have time to admire the scenery. Even if they didn't win, they had to save the Duke's family's face. Anthony shook his head and apologized for the delay, saying that he knew a place nearby where a golden fox appeared. At this time, Rudy was dragging a heavy bag on himself. Realizing that it was simply unbearable to run with such a burden, when he returned, he would definitely roast that damn horse meat. The saddest thing is that the guy couldn't even transform. It would be bad if he lost sight of the Duke. Although it is dangerous to transform here, although this is a small animal zone, Rudy realized this well when he turned into a crow. Suddenly, he saw someone's head from the distant bushes, deciding that someone had appeared there. The guy hesitated. It would be too far to throw the bag. He didn't even take a weapon with him because of laziness, thinking that he didn't care, and if it became too dangerous, he would simply run away and swung a stone at the stranger. Evan didn't see the object flying at him because he was talking to the Duke, just telling him about the black horse he had seen. The next moment, the stone hit the target straight away, and to his surprise, the guy began to fall on his back with his mouth wide open, his broken glasses immediately falling off his face. On closer inspection, Rudy realized he had made a fatal mistake when he saw the hair color. Hearing the sound of the falling body, Anthony ran to the servant asking if he was okay. The main character abruptly hid behind a tree, his whole body turning cold from the realization of what he had done. This boy must have been the Duke's assistant, Evan. Rudy was in great trouble. He never expected to meet the boy and the Duke like this. A former commander of the Imperial Knights and a war hero. That's who Rudy met. Duke Anthony, he will become the teacher of the novel's protagonist, who will one day turn the entire empire upside down. The guy heard the Duke's heavy steps hiding behind a tree. He was shaking with fear. He couldn't cross paths with the man here. Things didn't go according to plan. Rudy had planned to wait in the Golden Fox's habitat beforehand, and when Anthony arrived, the prince would accuse him of trying to steal the prey of a member of the Imperial family. The Duke would then be unfairly punished by being forced to carry a bag of stones for the rest of the competition, which is all Seventh had to do. Rudy gritted his teeth, not knowing what to do because everything had gone wrong. Anthony glanced sideways at the stone that had hit his servant. Someone had obviously thrown it on purpose. It was impossible to say whether they were aiming only at Evan, but the Duke thought that the killer was aiming at him. The boy was just beginning to come to his senses, and the first thing he said was the Duke's name. The man heard the servant's voice and asked him to tell him what he remembered. The Duke's family has protected the Imperial line for over 1,000 years and is the most powerful in the Empire. Rudy was the prince who was treated the worst, so there might be rumors that he tried to kill Duke Anthony. The servant bent over the ground, somehow wiping the blood from his face, desperately remembering what he had seen. And Rudy was slowly dying of fear, thoughts racing through his head like a hunted animal about what to do. Blood from the wounded back of his head slowly trickled down Evan's neck as he spoke. Rudy breathed a sigh of relief when he heard the servant ask for forgiveness because everything happened suddenly and he didn't remember. Anthony, focused on catching the villain, shouted to Evan that he understood everything. And he was just about to ask the guy to tell him if he remembered anything when he heard the rustling of leaves next to him. The main character decided that this was his chance and he needed to run away as far as possible. So Rudy, ignoring the danger, rushed away. The Duke immediately ran after him, as if after prey, asking the servants on the go to stay where they were and wait for his return. The chase lasted for more than 10 minutes. Rudy felt that his strength was running out. Running with a heavy bag was like death. Having decided that he had run far enough to get rid of such an old man, the guy looked back. But the damned Duke followed close behind, holding a sharp sword tightly in his hand. The man demanded that the fugitive reveal his identity, asking whether he was a rebel or a sectarian. He shouted that the boy could not escape the chase. The prince understood that the old man would soon catch up with him. Rudy considered dropping the bag and turning into a raven, but of course it would have been better if the damn horse had been nearby. But it's still better if the prince simply ran away. After these thoughts, something strange began to happen to the guy's body. He literally felt like he was running faster than before, and it no longer caused such discomfort. Anthony bared his teeth. He thought he had almost caught up with the fugitive, but he suddenly accelerated, and even his appearance changed. Perhaps his eyes were deceiving him. It was truly annoying, and the man began to chop with his blade left and right. After some time, he found himself in a bare clearing, having cut down all the trees nearby, but there was no one nearby. Rudy, meanwhile, continued to run. His body became light. He decided that he had become a raven, although he was definitely still running. The sounds of horse hooves were heard very close by. Could it be that the horse had returned? But it can't be that the seventh prince himself became a horse at that very moment. It was pure madness, but that's what happened. The beautiful black horse reared up and neighed loudly. Meanwhile, next to the first prince's table was his brother, and next to them lay a huge animal carcass. The second prince admired the first prince, asking if he had really caught the monster. The man stood proudly in front of a body the size of a small mountain. The second prince acknowledged that Edward had won the competition and asked if he had decided what wish he would ask of the emperor. The prince shook his head and grinned, replying that he had something in mind. At the other end of the forest, Rudy, who had turned into a human, was sitting under a tree. He covered his face with his hands in despair, burying his fingers in his hair, realizing that he was lost. Then he looked into the distance and remembered with horror that he had lost his bag while running away. Then he screamed and began rolling on the ground, exclaiming that he had lost the most important thing, and that there was a limit to how badly things could go wrong. But soon the seventh prince's hysteria subsided, and he lay on his back, looking at the sky. Nothing would change while he was suffering here, so it was worth retracing his steps and checking. It took Evan a long time to sit under the tree, and finally he saw that the Duke had returned. The man hid the blade and asked if the guy was feeling better. With a forced smile, he assured that he was fine, although his head was still a little dizzy. Anthony admitted that he was ashamed of his failure. He had missed the villain. Either he had been too quick, or the Duke was getting old. When the servant pointed to the bag at his feet, the man replied that he had picked it up on the way back. It was lying in the grass. Evan began to examine the thing, noting that it was quite luxurious, and for some reason it was filled with stones. The Duke did not know why and assumed that someone could be joking. At that moment, Rudy, who had been hiding behind a tree and waiting for the right moment, jumped out, screaming. He appeared behind the men, pointing to the bag that lay at their feet. They cried out in shock when they saw the seventh prince himself standing before them. Evan and Anthony dropped to one knee, respectfully greeting the royal. The Duke asked if the bag was Rudy's property, and he confirmed it. The guy put on a dismissive look and asked if her man had stolen her. He turned cold, exclaiming that this was absurd. He had simply found her by chance while walking on the grass. Rudy shrugged, replying that anyone would have come up with such an excuse, since no one wants to have their hand chopped off. To which the Duke swore on his worthless life and the honor of his entire family. Then the prince asked why the assistant was covered in blood, and the man mumbled that there had been an accident. After this, Evan slowly raised his low-hanging head, daring to look at the prince. The guy immediately remembered the memory that had left his head at the moment when he was hit by a stone. But his face was the last thing he saw before losing consciousness from pain. Evan opened his mouth and only managed to say Rudy's name before he darted towards the guy like lightning and grabbed him by the hair. Bringing his face close to the stranger's, the protagonist hissed that the puppy was very poorly behaved, since an inferior dared to brazenly interfere in the conversation of members of the Imperial family. If it's because his head hasn't healed yet, could Anthony borrow a sword, then the prince will fix it himself. Evan couldn't feel his legs from the fear that gripped his body, and he only looked pleadingly at the seventh prince. Anthony said that his assistant had made a grave mistake, and if His Highness showed mercy, he himself would severely punish him. Rudy praised the man's loyalty. A truly exemplary Imperial dog who didn't blink an eye when his assistant was in mortal danger. At that moment, the man vividly remembered the boy on the road who had been run over by his carriage. Moreover, Rudy said that the Duke's son would also grow up to be a faithful dog. The guy said that such a meeting was fate. He would believe the Duke and entrust the bag to him today. Looking at the man with a murderous gaze, Rudy said that this was a very important thing. Even if the Duke died, he should not let it out of his hands. He clutched the bag as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. Anthony, looking up at the seventh prince, said that he humbly obeyed the glorious order. Then Rudy turned around, exclaiming that he would go first and wishing them both a pleasant hunt. As the guy walked away, he thought that even he realized how lousy his acting was. I felt sorry for Evan, but he had to do something. The boy asked the Duke for forgiveness, and he replied that the servants were lucky that his limbs were still intact. Evan looked up at the man timidly, saying that he remembered the man who had thrown the rock at him. Finally, with a heavy sigh, the boy said that it was the seventh prince. Evan wanted to say something else, but the Duke interrupted him, firmly ordering him to be silent and not to say anything more. In the novel, Anthony causes an incident during the hunting competition the following year, but this is because the death of his son during that year led to a change of heart in him. So, for the incident to happen at this competition, the prince would have needed a fairly strong incentive. The first prince replied to his brother that he would ask the emperor to develop the area around the temple. These vagabonds, parasitizing in the capital of the empire like insects, he will sweep them all out of there. Rudy knew for sure that Duke Anthony's future was already sealed. The man, as if turned to stone, looked into the distance for some time, holding the bag in his hands. Fate will turn out such that he will rebel against the imperial family itself. The sun slowly sank below the horizon, hiding behind the high crowns of the trees. Rudy had just transformed from a raven into a human. Before descending, he checked everything 10 times from the air. There should have been no witnesses. He treated Evan and Anthony so horribly that it made the guy feel like a villain, which is what he was in the story. Rudy was watching the sunset and was thinking about the end of the competition, and he didn't hear anyone else's footsteps. A beautiful maiden, the first Princess Penelope, slowly approached him. She recognized the seventh prince, saying that this was the first time she had seen him walking alone in the forest. Rudy was surprised by her appearance. He certainly didn't expect to see a princess in such a place. The boy bowed to Penelope, expressing his recognition, and she spread her hands, urging him to drop the formal greetings, since the same imperial blood flowed in their veins. The girl asked with a smile where the prince's horse was. He replied that he decided to take a walk in the fresh air, so he left the horse in the camp. Penelope's face darkened in an instant, coldly retorting that she didn't understand her brother. Her next words were cold as steel. The girl asked why he would lie to his own sister. Rudy looked askance at Penelope, asking what she meant. She said that in the morning, while walking through the western forest, she saw an ownerless black horse. It had an unusual color, so the princess asked the servant, and she was told that it was the horse of the seventh prince. Penelope ordered that this black horse be killed, because the beast that does not obey deserves death. Rudy dropped to one knee and asked his sister for forgiveness. He was ashamed that he had failed to control the horse, so he had unwittingly lied. She waved her hand and asked the guy to raise his head. Otherwise, it seemed as if she was trying to punish her younger brother. Penelope had already left, saying that she was glad that Rudy had returned safe and sound, and that if he ever needed another horse, he should come to her. The first princess, Penelope, is difficult to deal with because it is impossible to understand what she is really thinking. But why does she just leave? Doesn't this ability work on Rudy? Late in the evening, when Evan and Anthony returned to the palace, the doctor came to see the servant. The doctor asked if Evan had really been chasing an animal, tripped over a rock, and fallen, hitting his head on another rock. He scratched the back of his head awkwardly when the man said that he had seen all sorts of injuries at every royal hunting competition. But this was the first time he had seen someone get hurt like this. The Duke asked how much longer he would need to recover. The doctor said that the injury could be quite serious on the outside. He would need at least a week of strict bed rest. The boy cried out hotly that he could not rest for the entire competition. As an assistant, he had to be next to the Duke. Anthony placed his hand on Evan's shoulder, appreciating his devotion, but his recovery came first, so he should rest and lie down until the closing ceremony. Evan smiled wryly, saying that if the Duke wished it, he would do his best to rest. For the first time in history, the assistant came to the hunting competition for a vacation, and the boy threw up his hands. He had never had any days off before, and all he wanted to do was live and have fun, but he had no money for it. The Duke laughed, promising to win for Evan's dream, and as a reward he would ask for the rights to develop the gold mine. It was deep night, but a candle was still burning on the table in the boy's room. He was fast asleep, sprawled out on the bed, the Duke's shadow leaning over him. The man left a small scroll on the bed which contained an important message. Anthony remembered the mocking face of the young prince who had called him an imperial dog who had not batted an eye when his assistant was in mortal danger. The Duke couldn't sleep and decided to go out for some fresh air. Something on the street distracted his attention, and his gaze turned to the corner. Well, there stood that very backpack of Rudy's, which he had ordered to guard like the apple of his eye. The time had come to carry out the errand, and the man threw the heavy burden onto his shoulders. Under the cover of night, he went straight into the forest, 3 moons illuminating Anthony's path. He once brought his son to the temple, telling him that long ago when the world was in chaos and confusion, a being descended from the heavens who brought salvation. The boy read about it in a book. His father had spoken about the Great Sierra. Being an incarnation of God, he possessed truly mysterious powers. Father and son looked at the majestic statue. The man said that Sierra conquered those who waged endless wars. And so, more than 1,000 years ago, he named the United Empire Abiran. He is the founder of the Imperial family, which the Duke's family served. Dawn came, and the exhausted Anthony mentally turned to his son, Flynn, to his precious treasure. Let him follow in his footsteps and become a proud sword for the Imperial family. The backpack was very heavy. Anthony wondered why he was carrying these stones with him. Suddenly, the man wondered whether it was out of loyalty or something else. With the first rays of the sun, the call of that very horn sounded. People gathered in the street. They were worried because the roar of the animals did not subside all night. The first prince has killed all the animals, which means the hunting competition is coming to an end. Originally, this royal hunting competition was supposed to last 4 days, because the first prince of the empire, Edward, set an incredible hunting record in just 1 night. The first Prince Edward is declared the winner of this hunting competition. The emperor congratulated his son on his victory, and the man thanked his imperial majesty. As tradition dictates, the emperor asked the first prince to state his wish. The duke was surprised at what wish he would make, since last year the fourth prince had asked for the right to clear out the nomads in the border regions. Recently, the area around the Temple of the Great Sierra has become overrun with vagrants, which poses a threat to the dignity and security of the temple. The first prince did not raise his head, but remained on his knees, speaking about restoring the temple to its former glory. Listening to this, Antony was shocked. His mind refused to believe what he heard. The figures of the warriors and his own stood over the numerous corpses of the enemies. And right now, Edward humbly asked for the right to cleanse the temple. The eyes of a murdered boy forever imprinted in the man's memory. The eyes in which he saw his reflection, the eyes that were dead. The loyal Imperial dog slowly reached out to his blade, pulling it from its sheath. The crowd retreated in fear as the Duke of the Empire began to swing his sword. He mentally asked his dear son Flynn for forgiveness. Evan was not yet awake, but he was aware of someone's face leaning over him. He jerked in fear and mumbled that he was greeting His Highness, the 7th Prince. Rudy ordered him to ask the doctor to prescribe antibiotics. No, olive leaves later, the Duke's assistant asked what brought the prince here. The guy waved his hand and asked if Evan didn't know what situation the Duke was in, since the closing ceremony was already supposed to begin. The boy stared at the prince in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. And Evan had better run to the square right now, which is what he did. The guy pushed his way through the crowd, apologizing but still pushing people with force. Finally, when Evan had passed the final line but was still apologizing, the words caught in his throat. Several of his guards surrounded his duke, who was kneeling. A little further away stood the first prince and the emperor himself. Edward was extremely angry and asked Antony through clenched teeth what was going on. He said that his family had served the Great Sierra since the very beginning and had protected the Imperial family shoulder to shoulder for over 1,000 years. It seems the family is more suited to such a menial task as fighting vagrants around the temple. Therefore, Antony Fidus humbly makes this request to His Imperial Majesty. The Emperor calmly replied that he highly appreciated the devotion to which the Duke had dedicated his entire life, and his request would be fulfilled. But still, it was a little funny to think that Antony's great loyalty made him go against the will of the monarch. Perhaps the man thought that the first prince would show mercy, but he had already begun to cast spells. The blue fire slowly flowed towards the Duke, and Edward mockingly said that the man had gone mad had he really forgotten that his current actions were punishable by immediate execution. The man, however, only replied that he would atone for the sin of interrupting the sacred ceremony with his life. Unable to remain silent, the devoted Evan leaned forward, shouting the Duke's name. Rudy realized that it was all starting, and it would be better if that guy also watched from afar. A figure in a cloak was collecting water in a container on the bank of a clean river. Suddenly, the water began to behave strangely, as if it were alive, swirling around the bottle. The stranger looked closely, not understanding what was happening. The question was in the air. Would the ceremony of Antony Fidus's execution be clearly visible? Would Manisa of the Imperial family be visible? Which she would have to confront. It was none other than the main character of the novel The Dark Header, Adam, the head of the Duke's family that had protected the Imperial family for 1,000 years, a former commander of the Imperial Knights who had won countless victories on the battlefield during his 30 years of service, and the one who committed a grave crime, insulting the Imperial family and will be punished for it, the sinner Anthony. In the name of the first prince of the empire, Rudy Abiran carried out the death sentence on a man without the right to a trial. Raising his hand, the man created a huge air tornado that began to envelop Anthony. The crowd, which instead of a competition also found itself at an execution, held its breath. Anthony, who had been standing humbly with his eyes closed until then, felt like he couldn't breathe. As the frosty air filled the air, the man opened his eyes. He saw Evan, who was being held by strange hands, trying to break free, looking only at his master. After all, the boy said that he was very dizzy, as if he was pretending. Anthony was glad to see that he was okay. Just think, they parted when the Duke was in such a miserable state. It was embarrassing in front of Evan, but at least he would have taken care of Flynn. The man turned his gaze and was surprised to see the 7th Prince. The Duke strained his ears, trying to hear what he was saying with such a serious expression. And only now he realized that it was not yet time. It was too early to die. But the cruel cat, the first Prince Edward, was already deciding someone else's fate, waving his hand. A few movements of the fingers and a thin beam of absolutely bright and pure energy rushed upward like a star, and already high above the ground behind the clouds, the figure of the Duke found himself trapped in the sphere. The water trap was closing, slowly killing the man, drops of blood mixing with the water. Then finally, with an inscrutable expression on his face, the prince waved his hand sharply to the side. Evan screamed, his eyes filling with tears as he realized that the master was about to meet his end. Rudy watched the events tensely, doing nothing. Flint, Anthony's little son, started as he sat at his desk. Someone's screams were heard through the open window, and it seemed as if a shooting star had appeared in the sky. Adam looked up, amazed, as the sphere streaked across the sky like a shooting star. As if something subconsciously pushed him, the man quickly ran after her. He clearly possessed magical powers, as he ran faster than the wind, trying to make it before the collision. The sphere approached the ground, and Adam ran directly underneath it. The man tried his best to see what was inside her, but everything was too blurry. Still, he was able to make out something. Was there really a person inside? Then Adam jumped high above the ground to get closer to the sphere. He stretched out his hand, straining his whole body, trying to reach the one who was inside the sphere. His palm passed through the strange substance that formed this prison. But something went wrong at that moment, and the man landed abruptly on the ground. He slid across the grass, finding himself on the very edge of a high cliff. With water running down his face in streams, Adam couldn't believe he had missed his target. All that was left was to stand and watch as the sphere flew on. Still, she landed far away in the forest, and one can only guess whether the future hero will be able to find her. Meanwhile, Evan was quietly whispering his master's name under his breath. No one could have imagined that the hero, Duke Anthony, would meet such an end. What will happen to his family now? The Emperor informed Evan that it was all over, and a new time for the closing ceremony was also announced. The royal hunting competition will conclude at noon, and orders have been given for the remaining competitors to proceed. The first prince lazily shook his palms, revealing that he had caught only one bug. When you show mercy, those who don't know their place will inevitably come to the surface. When Edward passed by Evan, he loudly said that the Duke's family was finished. Such an idiot was the head of the family. After this, the assistant, under everyone's gaze, slowly walked into the Duke's tent. The crowd began to reproach him, calling him a traitor, but the guy seemed not to hear anything. Rudy watched the assistant, knowing that his heart was probably breaking because he was close to the master. Returning to the temporary shelter, Evan began to clean up the broken rookery. Among the scattered blankets, he was surprised to find a small scroll. It was a letter, and on the wax seal was depicted the coat of arms of the Duke's family. After opening the scroll, Evan learned what Anthony wanted to say. When the moment of his death comes, let the assistant pray that the master can go to Terirum. The man asked Evan to take care of his son Flynn and let the assistant fulfill the old man's last request. The Duke had a feeling that he was about to make a huge mistake, and there was only one thing he needed to know if such a situation came up. His assistant Evan was absolutely not to blame for anything that happened. By the end of reading, the boy was crying loudly, his lips trembling on the last lines of the letter. Evan fainted when he read that the Duke was appointing him as acting head of the family. After the competition, Rudy arrived at the first prince's chambers, saying that he had used his manis very wastefully. Edward covered his bloody face with his hand. He was deeply mistaken if he thought he was completely cured. On the contrary, his condition worsened. The man shouted that he thought that this stone would absorb the contaminated manis, which meant that there was something wrong with Rudy's treatment method. The seventh prince grinned and advised them to free manis more slowly, as doing it hastily would only make things worse. Edward was furious. As soon as his health was restored, he would tear Rudy to pieces. The protagonist suspected this, but also knew that the first prince was breathing only thanks to the stone. Rumor has it that Evan is still in a coma, which is why Rudy felt guilty. Just as he was thinking that the guy shouldn't die because of this, Evan suddenly opened his eyes. He had lost a lot of weight during this time, lying in his bed asking where he was. A servant ran to the guy, seeing that he was trying to get up, shouting that the guy's body had not yet recovered. The assistant to the deputy head exclaimed that he had been unconscious for more than 2 weeks and could collapse at any moment. But Evan must first see the young duke and find out the situation in the family. The servant admitted that the situation was not the best. All the family's business partners had turned away and the internal staff had dispersed. The financial situation was dire, and it was impossible to ask for help from the Imperial family. At that moment, Flynn appeared in the corridor. Seeing him, Evan screamed and immediately ran up to the young duke. The boy dropped to one knee. Anthony's son asked him if he was feeling okay, and the deputy assured him that everything was fine. Flynn, even though he was little, understood that there were many problems. Even the preparations for his father's funeral had not yet begun. Evan realized that all this happened while he was in a coma and wanted to answer something when suddenly he heard conversations outside the window. The servants gossiped that Anthony had committed such a crazy act because the young duke was a vagabond, and it was strange that a man had a child at such a late age. The assistant was heartbroken to hear the others wanting to flee to avoid being branded as traitors to the Empire. Then the boy turned to Ricci, who was still nearby. Evan ordered the gossips' tongues to be cut out and brought to him as punishment for spreading false rumors about the young duke. The man looked at the deputy head in bewilderment, who asked if it was necessary to repeat it twice. Then Ricci bowed, replying that he would do everything as he was ordered. Evan also added that the family would not hold the duke's funeral, which greatly surprised his son. And because Anthony can no longer be considered a member of this family, Evan expressed hope that he will be understood. Flynn angrily asked the assistant why he was doing this, but he only replied that he was currently acting as the head of the family. Until the boy becomes the head of the family, Evan is obliged to protect it. Flynn looked in bewilderment at his father's assistant, who now looked nothing like his former self. He took off his glasses and announced that now, for the sake of honor and the survival of the Duke's family, he would use any means necessary. Meanwhile, shouts and curses were heard in the office of the first Prince Edward. Moreover, the future ruler did not hesitate to destroy everything he saw under his hands, accompanying his robbery with choice curses. He stood by the window, clinging to the windowsill and breathing heavily, like a cornered animal. The maid covered her ears with her hands in horror, hearing a new round of screams behind the door that the prince was locked in there. The man slammed his fist against the marble, crushing it with his strength, promising that he would strangle his brother with his own hands. Yesterday, he met with the seventh prince again, who told him that the first prince needed to announce to everyone that he was going to the Imperial forest, but not actually go there. This angered Edward. The man asked why the hell he should do such stupidity. Rudy replied that he wanted to go there, but no one should know about his whereabouts. If Edward announced his visit to the forest, no one would be able to enter there. The first prince frowned, asking what Rudy was up to and what he planned to do there alone. He grinned, saying that it was for the sake of treatment and that the first prince could sit in the room for now. The boy's frivolous tone angered his brother, who grabbed him by the neck and slammed him against the wall with all his might, calling him a bastard. The first prince used his power to put pressure on Rudy, who had recently started to think he was someone important. Edward could simply ask the Imperial scientists about such a trivial treatment. Rudy is really testing his patience. The first prince will definitely finish him off right now. The seventh prince smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his lips as he simply laughed at his brother's words, saying that he had better hurry. Since he just used Manus, his lifespan should be shortened again. As if to confirm his words, Edward began to cough, and thick blood poured from his mouth. Trying to suppress his cough, the man let go of his brother, who began to rub his neck. Rudy said that if the prince stopped the treatment now, he would not be able to even move normally for a whole week. The seventh prince asked with a grin, wasn't his brother curious about how the Imperial family would react when rumors spread that the Imperial prince had fallen ill? Will they look for a way to save him, or will their reaction be completely different? If the treatment fails, someone else will take the throne of the next emperor. While the first prince choked on his own blood, Rudy asked him if he understood that he was being told to think carefully if a man does not go to die. Perhaps it's because Rudy and Edward share the same blood, but Rudy's patience is not limitless. The guy turned around and walked towards the door, saying as a parting shot that they should stop assigning spies to him because disappearing without a trace was another of his talents. Since every time ends in failure, maybe it's time for the first prince to give up. This only delays the treatment and exhausts both of them. Sitting on his knees, Edward hissed through his teeth what Rudy's true goal was, why he was doing this. The protagonist stopped halfway and sighed heavily, thinking what to answer. If it comes down to it, perhaps Rudy's main goal is survival? A little later, the guy finally went to the Imperial forest in the body of a raven, carrying a small bag with him. He flew for a long time, dropping black feathers onto the crowns of tall trees along the way. Finally, landing on the ground, Rudy sighed heavily because he had already searched the entire forest 3 times and had not met a single soul. The boy had a good reason to clear this place, even at the cost of irritating the first prince, because today Rudy planned to experiment with his ability. After what happened last time, it became possible that the hero could transform into other animals, an ability that could be much more useful than he thought. To find out this, you need to understand your ability in detail because you need to know in advance how it can be used. First of all, it is necessary to find out the condition for transformation into the corresponding animal. After all, there had been physical contact with both animals that he managed to transform into. So, to test this hypothesis, you just need to catch a new animal. Deciding to start with little Rudy, he built a small trap. It was simple, but with bait, everything should work, and the guy also grabbed some select berries from the Imperial kitchen. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound near the nearest tree. The 7th prince asked if anyone was there. A squirrel was slowly approaching the guy along the trunk of a fallen tree. She looked at the guy with interest, but he hadn't even finished setting up the trap. Apparently tired of enduring hunger, the rodent ran straight up to the prince. The squirrel, without any hesitation, reached out with its paws to Rudy's palm, snatching the treats. The guy became interested in what the rodent would do if, given its gullibility, it was caught by someone bad. In any case, Rudy quickly made contact, and now he needs to put his plan into action. He quickly rose from his knees, deciding that it was time to begin his plan. The squirrel ran away in fear when the boy commanded himself to transform, and golden light poured from his figure. But unfortunately for the prince, nothing happened. The light went out, and he remained in his form. If you think about it, does the situation matter for turning into an animal? Because in the past, Rudy desperately wanted to fly and run faster. He didn't know what to do and what action the squirrel would take. Would it really climb into a tree or a hole? While the 7th prince was thinking, a cunning squirrel grabbed his bag, filled to the brim with nuts, and ran away. Hearing a loud squeak, only then did Rudy see what had happened and began to shout after her. If she wanted acorns, she could have simply asked to give her the bag, but the rodent quickly ran up the tree. But at the very last moment, Rudy suddenly pulled his hand up and grabbed the handle of the bag. He pulled it towards himself, and the squirrel, clinging to his belt with its paws, squealed desperately. The bag wouldn't budge, and Rudy clutched it even tighter, shouting that something so tiny wouldn't be able to hold on for long. The next moment, something terrible happened. The belt of the bag, as expected, broke. The cries and fuss caused many birds to break away from their perches in the trees and fly away. Anna knocked timidly on Rudy's door, telling His Highness that she had prepared dinner. The girl was afraid, but since the prince told her to come in, there shouldn't be any problems. When the door opened, Anna was frightened by the prince's appearance. He was covered in dirt, and his clothes were even torn in some places. Rudy urged the girl not to be afraid. He had simply gotten dirty while walking in front of the palace. Anna lied that she understood, and the 7th prince realized that he almost got caught when he turned into a crow. In the end, he didn't even figure out how to turn into a new animal and spent the whole day chasing that damn squirrel. Anna swallowed hard and looked at the prince carefully, trying not to attract attention. Rudy shook himself off and asked the servant to bring him new clothes. He needed to bathe before eating. The guy looked at Anna in surprise because she dared to object. The girl pointed with a trembling hand at the squirrel in the gentleman's bag and asked why he had brought the animal with him. Rudy screamed, looking down, not knowing that the squirrel had come for him. She jumped out of the bag and ran away. Rudy tried to catch her. Anna screamed and almost burst into tears, imagining that the prince would torture the poor squirrel. She wanted to take care of the squirrel herself, but the seventh prince again asked her to bring him clothes. The prince became angry, shouting that he had given orders earlier to have Anna quickly bring him clean clothes. She fluttered out of the office and rushed to the dressing room, realizing that she had to return quickly. She was already heading back, holding the clothes tightly in her hands. She had to hurry, otherwise something bad would happen to the cute squirrel. She had barely turned the corner when she suddenly encountered a significant obstacle. The majestic first princess appeared before the girl like a graceful statue. Penelope narrowed her eyes, looking Rudy's maid up and down, and asked where she was going in such a hurry. Anna fell to the ground, bowing and greeting Penelope, begging for mercy. She asked what kind of clothes the servant had in her hands, whether she was going to steal the things. Anna burst into tears, saying that this was absolutely not true. The princess reached out to touch the back of the girl's head as she babbled that the seventh prince had been walking in the garden and his clothes had gotten dirty. Penelope didn't care whether other people's words were true or not, because it was impossible to deceive her anyway. Were the words that this child spat out the truth or an attempt to save his own life? Penelope saw the image of her brother in the girl's head with the help of her power. He stood in dirty clothes, but the situation around him was different. It seemed that Rudy was not in the garden at all, but had some business in the Imperial forest. Meanwhile, Rudy tried in vain to catch the little animal. He didn't know how he got here at all. This place was not for him, and the prince had no desire to leave it. The squirrel didn't want to be caught. Rudy promised to return it to the forest, if only it would give him the opportunity to catch it calmly. If not, then the little animal will definitely have a hard time. The seventh prince narrowed his eyes. Even if it was just a squirrel, a rodent running around a human room, and in a palace at that, was completely absurd. Besides, it all reminded Rudy of life in that semi-basement apartment, when he couldn't sleep at night because rats were scratching at the walls. The plot was already deviating a little from the original, and this was starting to irritate the guy. He suddenly pulled his hand towards the little animal and finally caught it. It was desperately squealing and writhing. But the next moment the squirrel did not wait calmly for its fate, but sank its sharp teeth into the man's hand. He, of course, released the rodent, howling in pain, the rodent that dared to bite the hand of a member of the Imperial family. The little animal didn't care who it bit. It squealed and nimbly climbed the wall. Rudy raised his head, looking at the ceiling. The squirrel had indeed climbed high. He held his wounded palm, realizing that if he went after the animal, it would simply jump somewhere. The boy closed his eyes, thinking that in moments like these, it would be easier if he himself became a squirrel. The guy's eyes widened, and an incredible thought occurred to him. But if he just thinks about it, will this feeling really come back again, like during previous transformations? Rudy looked straight into the eyes of the little animal, and it did not look away either. Only then did the seventh prince finally understand the condition for transforming into a specific animal. The squirrel gave a short cry and closed her small eyes, her paws weakening. The rodent fell down, losing consciousness. Rudy was even afraid for him for a moment, because even for a squirrel, such a height was too high. At that moment, the door swung open. Anna begged the princess not to burst into the prince's room so suddenly, but she was not going to make concessions to her younger brother. Entering the room, Penelope raised an eyebrow, saying that the servants here were very unpleasant. She froze, looking in surprise at the two squirrels in the middle of the room. In fact, it was the transformed seventh prince, who was holding the forest rodent in his paws. The first princess was horrified, even though the prince was a child who was treated poorly by the Imperial family. The idea of wild animals roaming the chambers of a member of the ruling family was completely nonsense. Anna, however, had a different opinion. She looked at the rodents with admiration, finding them very cute. Rudy looked at the guests with dark eyes. It really drove him crazy. The next day, when passions had died down, Rudd was sitting at the table, and the squirrel was caressing his fingers. She hasn't left the man's side since last night. Is she really behaving this way in gratitude for saving her? Rudy was too lazy to take the squirrel into the forest, so let her try not to catch anyone's eye. Anyway, Rudy figured out how to turn into animals. Who would have thought the condition would be so stupid? If we recall the very first case, the raven into which the prince turned first. Then the black horse and the squirrel. They all had something else before their transformation. It wasn't just contact. The prince had to touch the back of the head. The activation condition is indecently specific for such a useless ability, but since Rudy figured out the transformation condition, we can move on. The real problem is first Princess Penelope. He couldn't fully imagine her from the descriptions in the novel, but he didn't think that the woman would have such a terrifying expression on her face. Luckily, Anna covered for the prince by saying that the squirrel was his pet, which gave Rudy the opportunity to escape through the window. Rudy returned to his human form and went to his room, pretending he wasn't there. Penelope noticed that her brother had a specific taste in pets and said that she would leave. Rudy already breathed a sigh of relief, getting ready to ask her to come later. But suddenly Penelope said imperiously, interrupting her brother, that he should come to her chambers tomorrow. The first princess smiled with her eyes, but there was a hint of danger about her when the woman said they needed to discuss something. Rudy shook his head, thinking that Penelope must have figured something out since she wanted to talk. The prince even thought that the woman had revealed his identity, but he immediately dismissed the thought. Finally, Rudy reached out, admitting that he had no choice but to simply refuse and not come. The seventh prince went to Penelope's chambers, and the guards greeted him. The knights reported that the first princess was waiting for her brother, and Rudy looked at the doors. He remembered from the description in the book that they were just as majestic. Penelope greeted him quite warmly, sitting on the sofa and smiling, assuming it had been a long journey. The woman invited her brother to sit down, and he initially refused, wanting to hear the reason for the visit. But Penelope interrupted him, and in her kindly tone, under which a real threat was hidden, she ordered Rudy to sit down. He hesitated and immediately asked for forgiveness for his unintentional rudeness. The princess laughed into her palm, admitting that Rudy's curiosity had gotten the better of him. He was always impatient. She wondered since when this child had become a completely different person and had dared to go alone into the Imperial forest, where he had never been before. Rudy's heart went cold. That's why he didn't want to meet the first princess. Manis always manifests as abilities related to nature. For example, the emperor possesses Manis of fire, and the first prince possesses Manis of water. Well, the abilities of the first Princess Penelope were the strongest. In a sense, she stands above all others. Her Manis is a person, with the ability to read and control other people's minds. The woman hoped that her brother would answer honestly, because she was very sad when her beloved family tried to deceive her sister. Penelope placed her hand on the back of Rudy's head. He tried to calm himself down. He knew one thing for sure. The princess's ability didn't work on him. If she had acted, the woman would have simply subdued him to get the answers she needed. She must have realized one day that her ability no longer affected Rudy. Thanks to the novel, Rudy knows two conditions under which Penelope's abilities will not activate. First, the target must be a blood relative. Secondly, the target must truly love Penelope as family. The problem is, in this second condition, to feel a familial love for this woman. There was no way in the world Rudy would feel that way about her, especially now that Penelope was asking him if he wanted to hurry up and answer. Then why the hell doesn't Penelope's ability work on him? Far beyond the forest, there was a deep cave, the entrance to which was securely closed by a waterfall. Drops of condensation dripped loudly from the ceiling onto the ground. One particularly large drop fell on the face of the lying man, who winced slightly. It was none other than Duke Anthony, who had been brought here by the first prince's water sphere. The water woke the man up. He coughed and came to, trying to brush off the annoying sound and sensation. The Duke stood up with difficulty, holding his head, thinking that this place was Tyrium or Cody. A voice was heard from the side. The stranger stated that the man was alive. Anthony cried out in fear, asking who it was and where he himself was. The man in the cloak thought that the one he found was dead. He pulled his sword from its sheath, announcing that he would now begin asking questions. Adam pointed his blade at the Duke, asking if he was a man loyal to the Abiran Empire. Adam did not answer the Duke's questions, but only demanded an answer to his. For the answer would determine what he would do next. The man trembled, but not from fear, as he looked at the tip of the dagger in front of him. Meanwhile, Penelope continued to test Manas's ability on the seventh prince. She continued to demand an answer as to why he had suddenly become a completely different person. If her ability isn't working, there must be a good reason. Maybe it has something to do with Rudy possessing another character. The seventh prince was so insignificant that there was almost no information about him. He was barely mentioned in the novel. Penelope could hear the gears turning in the guy's head. It must be hard for him to answer. Rudy kept thinking about what to do, pretend to be a fool, because the woman wouldn't leave him alone so easily. The seventh prince wondered how the character might respond in such a situation. Then the first princess walked away. Since her brother did not intend to answer, she would resort to another method. The woman clapped her hands, inviting the Imperial knights to enter. They entered the room. The first princess said that she was upset by the silence of her dear brother. So, to loosen his tongue, let the knights cut the guy's mouth open with Abiran's swords.
The men were dumbfounded, muttering that insignificant servants could not commit such a crime.
They dropped to one knee, declaring that they could not carry out such an order, and that Her Majesty should change her mind. She wearily put her hand to her head, declaring that they were making too much noise. And then the woman used her strength on the guards, declaring that she couldn't stand this. Of course, this had an effect on the knights. The lights of obedience lit up in their eyes. They suddenly pulled their sharp blades from their sheaths and headed towards the guy. Rudy was surrounded on both sides, and now the guards only listened to the first princess. After all, he didn't answer, so what can we do now, right? Penelope advised him to choose his words carefully, and was about to tell him the only way to get out of this. Then Rudy decided to take a desperate step, exclaiming that his mother had died. The woman suddenly fell silent, turning to her brother. Then she asked in surprise what he was even talking about now. She looked at Rudy incredulously, asking where he got that idea from, whether he had really been keeping in touch with his mother all this time. The seventh prince looked away, saying that, not at all, because if there are some circumstances. Before leaving, the mother left Rudy one thing, a beautiful necklace with a blue stone in the middle. She told her son that as long as this blue light does not go out, they will be able to meet again. But some time ago, the blue light began to slowly fade, and then the stone suddenly turned black and crumbled. After a brief moment of panic, a thought occurred to him. That the mother, who had been homesick all her life, had finally found peace in her native lands in the east. Penelope blushed. She didn't know that this was a complete lie from beginning to end. Among the many favorites who bore the emperor's children, she was the only one who was able to escape from the Imperial family. The reason for her escape was never revealed, but it was assumed that she returned to her hometown in the east. Some believed that it was because the woman gave birth to a black-haired prince. But one way or another, she did not appear until the very end of the novel. The first princess thought that Rudy hated his biological mother. The boy replied that he himself was not sure. When he was little, he was only angry at her for abandoning him. Perhaps this is the reason why he constantly looked towards the eastern sky and took out this necklace every night. Rudy took out the necklace to show Penelope, saying that he missed his mother, and that must be true. His sister asked if this changed his opinion of his blood relatives. Rudy remarked that it was truly amazing. A whole life could turn into an instant of melancholy. Perhaps that's what family is all about, at least that's what Rudy thought. Penelope seemed to look seriously for the first time at her brother, who was saying such strange things. Then she ordered the knights to put away their swords and wait at the door. They bowed. Penelope also used magical power to erase everything that happened in that room. Rudy was surprised that everything worked. The woman shook her head, feeling the seventh prince. She took her brother's hands, saying that he must have suffered a lot. The first princess said with a smile that even if Rudy was a black-haired loser, he was still her little brother. With a woman's ability to manipulate anyone at will, it was only natural that she would become suspicious when such absolute power suddenly stopped working. Be that as it may, his lie worked. He survived, and the necklace was just a cheap trinket he found under his feet. Then Rudy wondered what happened to the Duke. In the original, he falls into a gorge and loses his legs. Whether he managed to meet the main character, the guy only hoped that the Duke had not died in that cave. While in the gorge, Anthony tried to get up, but Adam advised him not to move. He still held the man at sword point, reporting that his right leg was broken. Unarmed and with a broken leg, Anthony doesn't stand a chance in his current state. Even through the darkness, he sees that the stranger has an impeccable stance. The tip of his sword is razor sharp, and one glance is enough to understand that he is incredibly strong. The tip of the sword almost touched his neck. The Duke, stuttering, asked to put the sword away first. Adam cocked his head to the side, guessing that the man had only recently regained consciousness. A few days ago, Adam noticed a water sphere flying across the sky. At first, he tried to catch up with it, but it was too fast, so he missed the sphere. Apparently, there was someone inside, but since she hit the ground at such a high speed that someone should have been torn to pieces. The Duke understood what they were talking about him, the water sphere from the execution of the first prince. But how is he still alive? Suddenly, Anthony remembered the very bag of stones that the seventh prince had given him. He felt the ground around him, realizing that the bag was not nearby. It must have fallen out during the execution. Adam continued to say that he had accidentally found an old man lying unconscious and covered in blood in a nearby cave. Suddenly, he thrust the tip of his sword sharply right next to the Duke's head, almost killing him. He let out a strangled cry as the sword pierced the ground next to his shoulder. Adam looked at the man with a mad look, asking in the name of the goddess Amika if the Duke of Abiran was loyal to the Empire. Of all the people Anthony could have met in such a situation, it had to be a heretic. They look like ordinary vagabonds from these parts, just like the child killed by the carriage. The Duke immediately remembered his trusted assistant, Evan, the face of the seventh prince, who called the Duke an Imperial dog who didn't blink an eye when his assistant was dying. The Duke narrowed his eyes as he looked at Adam's face, wondering what to say. He remembered looking at his only son, Flynn, his treasure, his hope, the future of the Duke's family and his heir. While they were in the temple, the father told his son that he should follow in his footsteps and become the sword of the Imperial land. As he said, it was necessary to exterminate all heretics threatening the Empire, but now everything has changed. Opening his eyes, Anthony exclaimed that he knew nothing about the loyalty of the Abiran Empire. He simply stumbled while wandering here out of carelessness. He is just a senile old man.